So welcome everybody to the religion talk that's hosted by the Department of Religion at Rutgers. My name is Tao Jiang. I'm the chair of the department. So our speaker today is John Powers. That's no stranger to many people in this crowd. John Powers is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Humanities and professor of religion at Deakin University in Australia. He had been at Australia National for many years. He's the author of 18 books and more than 100 articles and book chapters, mainly on Buddhist philosophy, history of ideas, as well as environmental history, human rights, and gender, and propaganda. His books, recent books include A Bowl of a Man, Images on Masculinity, Sex, and the Body in Indian Buddhism. This is from Harvard in 2009. And more recently, co-authored book, Dignag's Investigation of the Percept and its Philosophical Legacy. This is from Oxford in 2017. So today he will talk about the three-nature doctrine in Yogācāra Buddhism with the title, Can Ultimate Reality Change? Controversies regarding the yogic practice school's path to awakening. John.
Thank you, Tao. First of all, I'd like to thank Tao for inviting me to do this and for arranging everything. And also he contributed to my Zoom uplift. He showed me how to share a screen, which I've never done successfully before. So this has already been a learning experience. I hadn't realized how many, or I hadn't expected so many Yogācāra specialists to show up. So I was positioning this talk for academics in general, probably some Buddhologists who didn't know much about Yogācāra. So some of my initial remarks are probably going to be a bit obvious to a lot of people who work in Yogācāra, and for that I apologize, but it looks like there are still a number of people who aren't Yogācāra specialists, and so this will hopefully be helpful to them. I'm going to be talking mainly about the three natures doctrine in Yogācāra, which I'll get to in a second, and particularly about how this is interpreted. And the interesting thing about it, a lot of this is fairly technical, but it really, it intersects with some fundamental aspects of Buddhist meditation theory and Buddhist soteriology. So there are important implications for how we understand Buddhist meditation literature, particularly in relation to the Yogācāra school. And also, I think it brings up some questions about how we read this literature, what we bring to it when we look at it, and methodologies for thinking about, for thinking through how to interpret, translate, and present these texts. So firstly, for non-specialists, there are two main philosophical schools in Indian Buddhism. There's the Middle Way school, or Madhyamaka, and the Yogic practice school, or Yogācāra. The Madhyamaka school is primarily concerned with debate and reasoning, not so much with meditation. One of my PhD advisors, Karen Lang, at one point decided that she was going to do a project on Madhyamaka meditation. And she went through the entire canon and found that she didn't have enough material even for an article. So what that shows is that the Madhyamakas may have done meditation, they probably did, at least some of them, but they didn't talk about it or didn't become an integral part of their writings. Whereas Yogācāra, part of the Yogācāra critique of other Buddhists is that many of them have ignored meditation, which they see as the fundamental aspect of Buddhism. And the term Yogācāra means practitioners of yoga or yogic practice. And so right from its inception, this is a tradition that emphasizes epistemology and practice. One thing that I want to mention at the beginning is the idea of the two truths in Buddhism. This is sort of fundamental to this discussion we'll be having today. These are the conventional and the ultimate truth. Most of you already know about this, of course. Conventional truths are truths that are true on the conventional level. That is, truths that accord with how we perceive reality on the conventional level. Ultimate truths are truths that are ultimately true. That is, when examined in terms of ultimate analysis, what we find is the ultimate truth, which undermines or deconstructs the conventional truth. So the focus of this talk is going to be on the three natures, or Trisvabhava, or three characters doctrine in Yogācāra, which in many ways is a refinement or a take on the two truths. So the three natures are the imputational, parikalpita. The term pari is an intensifier, meaning very or extremely. Kalpita comes from the root word kult, to make or to construct. So this is something that is thoroughly constructed, something that's brought into being, that's made up. The other dependent, paratantra, is what is dependent on other factors. So this refers to the Buddhist doctrine of dependent arising, the fact that things come into being in dependence upon causes and conditions that are external to themselves. They change from moment to moment in dependence upon causes and conditions, and they eventually disintegrate and pass away as a result of causes and conditions. So this corresponds to the conventional truth. That is, this things on the conventional level are other dependent. They are affected by causes and conditions. But this is not the ultimate truth. The ultimate truth is called parinishvana, again with the intensifier pari. Nishpad means to establish, or to, it has the idea of something that is fixed, something that is true, and something that is independent of causes and conditions. So as presented in the Yogacara literature, these are three ways in terms of which phenomena can be viewed. Ordinary beings under the influence of delusion will see things from the imputational perspective. They'll see things with a conceptual overlay that is false. When they come to understand things in terms of how they exist conventionally, they will see things from the other dependent perspective. That is, they'll see them as being created and changed by causes and conditions external to themselves. When they eliminate the false superimposition of the imputational, they'll see what I translate as the ultimately real, or parinishvana, or the true. So once you get rid of these false conceptions, you see reality as it is. So this is where it gets interesting, I think. So the ultimately real nature is really going to be the focus of what I talk about today. And as I mentioned before, there are problems in terms of how it's been presented and particularly translated. And I think that these bring up a number of other conceptual problems for the interpretation of Yogacara literature and the Yogacara path to awakening. So it's important to note that the ultimately real nature is equated in Yogacara literature with other terms for ultimate reality. Things like ultimate truth, paramartha, emptiness, shunyata, suchness, tatata, reality limit, and buddhakoti. And here's the one that I think is particularly important. It's referred to throughout the literature as a purifying object of observation, vishuddha alambana. This is something that meditators focus on, and by focusing on that process of meditation, of becoming familiar with the ultimately real nature, serves to eliminate affliction. So this is a key element of the Yogacara path as conceived in this literature. The fact that it's a purifying object means that this is the thing that you focus on in order to bring about change, in order to progress on the path. Now, the locus classicus for this text is the Discourse Explaining the Thought, Sandhina Sutra, which was the text that I worked on for my PhD dissertation. And I've continued to come back to this in various ways, also the commentary literature, which is quite extensive and has a lot of very important material, most of which has really not been explored very much at all. And as you can see from the text below, it's also this doctrine of the three natures is something that shows up in some of the most important fundamental texts of Indian Mahayana Buddhism. So it's obviously something that was seen as quite important to Indian authors. It's even the basis of an entire text, the exposition of the three natures, or Trisvabha Nirdesha, attributed to Vasubandhu, which is probably the most insightful and I think provocative presentation of the three natures that we find in Indian Yogacara literature. There's also some very interesting material in the Vedanta Vibhaga Bhasha and the Mahayana Sutra Alankara and its commentaries. And I'll be talking about all of that today. Now, the locus classicus, again, is the Discourse Explaining the Thought, the Sandhina Sutra. And the discussion of this begins in chapter 6. Now, for those of you who don't know the sutra, it consists of 10 chapters in the Indian and Tibetan versions. And in each of these, you have a bodhisattva who is at the 10th level, the 10th bhumi, that is the penultimate level before Buddhahood. So one of the things is that the internal logic of the text is trying to set up is the notion that this is a very advanced text. This is a text in which the only participants are very advanced practitioners. And so presumably their questions of the questions from 10th level bodhisattvas are going to be at the highest level and intended for advanced practitioners. So in chapter 6, the Bodhisattva Gunakara, who is the interlocutor of the text, asks the Buddha why some bodhisattvas are designated as, quote, wise with respect to the character of phenomena. And the Buddha answers that these bodhisattvas are people who thoroughly understand the three characters and natures. In other words, by understanding the three natures, you come to be someone who can be designated as wise with respect to the character of phenomena. There should be an R of character, obviously. So the imputational is that which is imputed as a name or symbol in terms of the inherent nature of the attributes of phenomena in order to subsequently designate any convention, whatever. It's compared to the hairs perceived by people with impaired vision, that is, that it's entirely false. As a footnote here, one of my former students is now an ophthalmologist, and I contacted her a while ago to discuss with her how the Buddhist text might be interpreted contemporarily by ophthalmologists. And she pointed out that actually the hair, this might not be a great analogy because the hairs that people with ophthalmia see are actually real. That is, they're floaters in their eyes. So they're little bits of matter that are floating out of the eyes. So when they see these things, they're actually seeing something that does exist. They're not purely false. But that said, they will often see things like, say, flowers in the sky, and they see these hairs as external, that is not inside the eyes. So to that extent, it is still false. So I guess if we're going to be updated, there might be other sorts of analogies that the Buddhists might use today. So he says that, so I'm going to focus again on the ultimately real character, on parinishvana. So the Buddha says that it is like the non-erroneous objective referent of the eyes after one eliminates clouded vision. That is, once you have cured your ophthalmia, then you see things as they are. And this is analogous to the to parinishvana, to the ultimately real nature. And one of the most extensive commentary on this is from the Korean scholar Wonchuk, who wrote a 3-volume commentary, 3 volumes in the Tibetan canon, that goes into extraordinary detail on every single passage and every single term. And he has a lot of very interesting and very thought-provoking material on the three natures. So he comments that it's called the thoroughly real, parinishvana, because it is not chained to something else, because it is a purifying object of observation, because it is the supreme of all virtuous phenomena. He says it's like a minister was free from falsity. And he adds, through comprehension of it, meditators give rise to the non-conceptual exalted wisdom of equality. And this is a very high level of meditative attainment. He also says that it's ultimately complete, and that means that it's all-pervasive. And he adds, it's ultimately real. That means that it's permanent. This is, by the way, a very important point, that it's permanent. It is the suchness of phenomena. This indicates that it is not false. So Asanga goes into a lot of detail in the Mahayana Sutra Alamkara, the Ornament for Great Vehicle Discourses. And this passage here, I think, is particularly important in terms of understanding how this is presented in Indian Yogacara literature. He says it's not existent, not non-existent, neither the same nor different. It neither arises nor ceases, bear that in mind. It does not increase nor decrease. It does not become pure, and still it is pure. It is the character of ultimate truth. The commentary, because the sphere of reality, the Dharmadhatu, is unconditioned, it neither arises nor ceases. And by way of its being originally unafflicted and also not being purified due to the elimination of adventitious afflictions. So you should understand that these 5 characteristics of non-duality are the characteristics of the ultimate. The second most extensive commentary attributed to Jangjuk Sudrul, we're not really sure who he is. If anybody's interested, I'm happy to talk about that later. He talks about the imputational character, which I don't really need to go into. We've already covered that. Now, the other dependent character, I think this is very important, and it sets up some of the things I'm going to be talking about later. He says the other dependent character is produced by the power of other conditions, but is not produced by way of its own nature. Therefore, since it exists merely like a magician's illusions in terms of conventional truths, it is an absence of nature due to being an absence of nature in terms of production. Moreover, because it does not have the ultimate absence of nature, because it is not a purifying object of observation. It is not an ultimate absence of nature, because it is not an ultimate truth. And this is particularly important in terms of some of the points that I'm going to make later. He's explicitly saying that it is not a purifying object of observation, which is what all of the literature on this agrees is the characteristic of Parinishvana, of the ultimately real nature. And then he describes the ultimately real nature. He says, it is an absence of nature, and the ultimately real character is the ultimate. Moreover, the ultimate is distinguished by being the absence of nature of all phenomena, and because it is both the ultimate truth and the absence of nature, it is an absence of nature due to being the ultimate absence of nature. And this is very important because what they're all saying is that this is not something that is brought into being. It's not something that changes. It's something that's permanent, it's changeless, it's always the case with all phenomena. So now to sort of sum up where we are so far, the three natures schema as presented in this literature is a way of understanding the Buddhist path to liberation. And it outlines for practitioners different ways, how different ways of perceiving phenomena will create the world that you inhabit and will affect your mental state. So deluded beings operate on the imputational level. Because of this, they're enmeshed in ignorance and suffering. Conceptual knowledge of the other dependent, on the other hand, provides a correct conventional perspective that is, serves to undermine the false imputations that we superimpose onto phenomena. And finally, the elimination of afflictions, a cultivation of good qualities, that is compassion, wisdom, generosity, and ethics, requires an enduring meditative object, one that corresponds to ultimate reality. And I should mention parenthetically here that this is also based on a standard idea in Indo-Tibetan Buddhist meditation literature, which is that meditation, the Sanskrit term is bhavana, is something that involves familiarizing the mind with an object of observation. That is, you focus on a particular object, something that serves as the focal point of your meditation. And through this, your mind becomes transformed gradually through this process of meditation and familiarization to the point where your mind changes, where your mind becomes different from what it has been, and where you come to progressively move along the path and acquire these sorts of good qualities like compassion and wisdom and so forth. And ultimately, this results in things like ashraya paravarti, the transformation of the basis in Yogacara literature, and ultimately in the attainment of Buddhahood. So this has very important soteriological ramifications for Indian Buddhism. And finally, only the ultimately real character or nature provides the necessary certainty and infallibility to make this happen. So this is where the Buddha talks about the path. So he says, the Buddha sort of sums up the discussion in this chapter by saying, when bodhisattvas know characterless phenomena as they really are, with respect to the other dependent character, then they completely abandon the phenomena of afflicted character. In other words, this has a positive effect on them. When they have completely abandoned phenomena of afflicted character, then they realize the phenomena of purified character. In other words, this is a step beyond the understanding of the other dependent of Paratantra. And Wanshu comments that by understanding the other dependent, bodhisattvas understand that everything is cognition only. This is an important term in Yogacara, one which a number of you have already written on, so most of you probably already know about this. When they thoroughly comprehend the ultimately real, even cognition only is transcended. This is an important point. At that time, because objects of observation and observers are equalized for those bodhisattvas, the non-conceptual exalted wisdom of equality arises. Therefore, those bodhisattvas have entered into understanding of the ultimately real nature. So this is kind of the soteriological payoff for this, for bodhisattvas who practice this path. So the soteriological implications are important for both the Sangha and Siramati. Asanga says that bodhisattvas focus on the thoroughly real, and through this they eliminate perceptions of subject-object duality. This leads to the transformation of the basis, ashraya parivartana, on the path of meditation, and this eliminates residual mental afflictions. So in other words, this is a really important thing. This is not simply a sort of philosophical issue for them. This is something that really is fundamental to practices understood in the Yogacara tradition. Stiramati has a number of really interesting things to say about this, which I can't really go into in too much detail, but he refers to 5 aspects in terms of what it means to say that it's the ultimately real. And he says that it's a productive object because bodhisattvas arise on this basis. In other words, by understanding parinishvana, the ultimately real nature, bodhisattvas come to be bodhisattvas. It's also an expansive object because hearers, that is Hinayanas, meditate on it, and it causes them to become bodhisattvas and dedicate themselves to the liberation of all sentient beings. And it's an object for mastering all the bodhisattva levels. So he equates this, he understands this as something that functions throughout the path from the very beginning, from the inception of the bodhisattva path, right up to the very beginning, that meditators continue to focus on the ultimately real nature. And through this, they accumulate the sorts of qualities and experience the sorts of realizations that are aspects of the path to liberation in Yogacara. Now, here's where the interpretational issues come up. So the two most important and I think influential interpretations of the three natures have come from Alan Sponberg and Gudgeon Nagao. And I think particularly Nagao's influence continues to resonate throughout the field. You'll see at the end that I've made up a chart that shows that the overwhelming majority of people in the field continue to employ terminology for the ultimately real nature, for parinishvana, that resonates with both Sponberg's and Nagao's interpretations and readings of this. So I want you to, bear in mind what we've said so far about parinishvana, that it's something that's ultimately real, that it doesn't change, that because of this, it can function as a purifying object of observation. And this is something that is used throughout the path as the basis for the type of practice that bodhisattvas are doing. But Nagao says that the three nature schema is based on what he calls a principle of convertibility. For both Nagao and for Sponberg, the other dependent, Paratantra, is primary. This is what's really real. It's converted into the ultimately real through the actions of meditators. Sponberg refers to this, he says that this is the dominant tradition in India. He calls this the pivotal model. The other dependent, he says, has an axial position. It can be mistaken for something imaginary, or it can be understood in terms of its true or consummate nature. And this is important. He says, what exists is the dependent. The imaginary and two mutually exclusive aspects of the dependent. It becomes consummated through the efforts of yogis. In other words, this is something that's brought about, something that's actualized through what meditators do. So meditators transform their perceptions of the dependent, but it itself does not change. He says, one is left with phenomenal world quite intact, though profoundly valorized in one's experience. The dependent is reality, that's his emphasis, when properly seen. Now, I'm going to switch now to what the Yogacara texts say. So one of them, this is a difficult concept, obviously. It's not something that for many people is going to be obvious conceptually. So the Yogacara texts have a number of analogies to help people to understand this. One of them is this a very common idea that's found in Indian philosophical literature of a rope and a snake, where somebody in a dark room sees a coiled rope, perceives it as a snake and reacts to it as if it were a snake, and then subsequently sees that it's actually just a rope, and then the wrong perception of the snake disappears. So Sponberg equates the imaginary with the snake, which is a pretty obvious one. The other dependent is the rope. That is, this is something that remains after the snake illusion has disappeared, which is overlaid with the illusory perception of a snake. The ultimately real, he says, is the hemp from which the rope is made. Now, this is a very strange interpretation because in none of the texts in which this analogy comes up is hemp even mentioned. And if you think about it from an Indian Buddhist perspective, there's no reason why hemp would be any more primary than anything else. And if you look at hemp, hemp itself is composed of even smaller particles, paramanu, tiny particles that are the compositional factors of macro objects. So there's no reason to think that you would stop with hemp as the ultimately real referent of the rope and the snake. So if you're going to go an Abhidharma route and look at, say, fundamental particles that compose things, you would have to go much further down the scale in order to do that. And this is not what Yogacara texts are doing. So as I mentioned, the Yogacara texts don't even mention hemp. And as we've seen before, this reading contradicts how they present the three natures. Another one that I used to think actually was kind of concordant with this reading, particularly the way Nagao reads it, is the example of auriferous clay, that is clay that contains bits of gold ore in it. And the ore, this clay is smelted, and then the dross elements are burned away, and what's left is the gold. So Nagao sees this as something that corroborates his idea that what is ultimately real is the dependent nature, the paratantra. But if you look at the analogy more closely, it really doesn't say that at all. What it says is you have gold, which is gold, which is what it is. That's the essence of what it is. And then there are dross elements surrounding it, which prevent it from being seen. And then these are burned away, but the gold doesn't change. There's no change that happens with the gold. The gold remains what it is all throughout this process. It's just that everything that obscures the perception of the gold is now removed, and now we're able to see the gold was always there all along, which has never been changed. And this again is meant to indicate how parinishmana, the ultimately real nature, functions in this system. So he said, Nagao says that it should be ultimately real, is perfected or consummated through the efforts of yogis. So presumably, he doesn't say this, but drawing out the implications of what he says, if there were no yogis, there would be no ultimately real nature. Since this is something that's brought about through their efforts, if nobody were transforming or consummating or perfecting paratantra, then there would be no parinishmana, according to Nagao's model. So he says, and this is his I think the clear summary of his idea, consummated means perfect, real, and existent, and it connotes reality, truth, and existence, or the absolutes. So far, we're in agreement. It does not mean that this reality exists in an ontological sense, or that it is to be perceived epistemologically, which I think is exactly what the Yogacara texts say is happening. It is a reality completely perfected or consummated by a practitioner through arduous practice. And he says it's not a quality phenomenon, it's the result of yogic practice. Nagao, he has two articles on the three natures. One is the three natures and its similes. He cites the Zen saying about mountains and rivers. That is, when I first started practicing Zen, mountains were mountains and rivers were rivers. As I entered the path, mountains were no longer mountains and no longer rivers. But now that I have moved to the other, that I've passed through this, that I followed the path, mountains are mountains and rivers are rivers. All fine, all good Zen philosophy, but that isn't what the Yogacara texts say, and there's no passage that I've seen in any Yogacara text. And if any of you Yogacara Wallahs know of any, I'd really like to hear about it, but I've never seen anything in any Yogacara text that corresponds to the Zen idea of mountains and rivers. So Nagao summarizes his ideas on this. He says, the world must remain at all times one and the same. Therefore, the fact that the world is constituted of three natures does not mean that there are three worlds or three different realities side by side. It means that there is a world that is convertible from one nature to the other. So just to return to what we were saying earlier, the important point, the thing that for me is really crucial here is understanding what it means to say that something is a purifying object of observation, of Vishuddhalambana. Wanchuk has a number of very important and I think very succinct points that he makes about this. He says that a Vishuddhalambana has three aspects. It is permanently changeless, which seems to be completely opposite of what Nagao and Svanberg is saying. It is a nature of virtue and happiness, which is, again, we've seen before. This is something that is used on the path as an object that bodhisattvas focus on as a way of familiarizing their minds with it in order to bring about the cultivation of good qualities. And he says it manifestly accomplishes everything. In other words, this is the facilitating object rather than the outcome of practice. So it is an immutable, permanent quality of phenomena that is in no way dependent on human activity for its actualization. Because of this, it's able to facilitate attainment of advanced levels of realization. So I ask parenthetically, why are so many contemporary academics think that it changes due to the efforts of meditators? Now, and I should also mention that not everybody does this. I should single out Joy Brennan, who has written several very perceptive articles that are very close readings of the text that have pointed out that I think correctly interpret what Parinishvana is. But as we'll see at the end, she also uses terminology that is concordant with Nagao's and Swanberg's. So even people who correctly interpret this are still in many cases using terminology that undermines the impact of what their readings would indicate. We're getting to the end here. So I think as I've been working on an article which is about to be published, by the way. It'll come out in Sophia in a couple of months, hopefully, in which I lay this out in much greater detail, and in which I have numerous passages from Yogacara texts, from commentaries, from primary texts, and so forth, that I think I hope make a compelling case for this presentation, for my reading of this. But as I've been doing this, I've been really thinking, as I've been revising this material, I've been working on this off and on for quite a while now, but I've been wondering why so many people have put forward interpretations that I think really don't work in terms of what the texts themselves actually say. And I recently had what I think is a bit of an insight, where I think that it may come from a conflation of two primary functions of what the three natures, how the three natures schema functions in Yogacara literature. And I think the interpretational issues may have arisen due to this. So on the one hand, it's a description of how things exist. Okay, so they have three qualities, three aspects in terms of which they can be viewed. And individual beings, depending on where they are in their realization, will focus on one of these due to their respective levels of awareness. So these three natures are what they are independently of the mental activities of those who perceive their environments in one of these three modes. But it is a description, in a sense, of sort of epistemological hermeneutic, as I've described it in other places, where it gives you if you are a practitioner and you're trying to get a sense of where your perception is, you can look at it this way, and you can see where, what sort of ways in which you're perceiving, what are the ways in which you're perceiving phenomena, and you can get a sense of, in a sense, where you are conceptually, or in terms of practice. It also serves a soteriological function. Beings who apply it in a meditative context can better understand the causal factors underlying their perceptions, and by eliminating falsities, they can gain intuitive knowledge of the ultimately real nature. And through this, they will eliminate afflictions and progress on the path. So in other words, it does two things. It both gives you an interpretive grid for experience, and it also is an outline for how the Yogacara path is conceived in this literature. Now here, the last slide, I think is kind of interesting. I'm not going to go over this entirely, but as you can see, I've laid out, I went through the literature. One of the first comments I received from the assessors when I submitted this article was that what I thought was a pretty clear thing, that is that, this terminology resonant of the ideas of Nagao and Spanberg was so widely attested in the literature, that I didn't really think there was any question about it. But the assessors thought that I really needed to provide evidence. So I went through what I thought were the most important discussions of Yogacara by the most important people doing this, and you'll see that a lot of you guys are on this in one way or another. And so you can see things like perfected nature, perfected or consummated nature. Then you'll see others that I would more agree with, the ones on the right-hand side. So the absolute, which is what Capstein uses, l'absolu, Lamotte, Troll and Dragonetti, the absolute. Jeffrey Hopkins uses thoroughly established natures. Gareth Sparlam, sort of following the same sort of trajectory, calls them thoroughly established phenomena. I used to use thoroughly established natures. I was a student of Jeffrey Hopkins, and I was influenced by his take. And Jeffrey's translation does accurately represent how the Tibetans translated Yongsu Drupa, which does mean something like thoroughly established or thoroughly real. I think it's kind of a clunky one. I think it's accurate enough, but I don't think it really tells you very much. I think that ultimately real is a much clearer indication of what this means in the literature and how it's interpreted. So that's what I've come to over the course of quite a number. I've probably gone through about 7, 8, 9 or so different translations of it. And I finally decided that ultimately real or true is probably the best translation, at least from my readings of these texts. So anyway, that's really all I have to say. And now it's up to you folks to weigh in and see what you think.
Okay, thank you very much. So maybe you can stop the sharing and then we can see everybody. So that would give us a good communal. Oh, great. So, all right. Thank you. So the floor is open. You can, again, either raise your hand or raise your digital hand or type it in the chat room, whichever way you want to go. Usually the first one you want to go, then you can just unmute yourself because before anybody else.
I have a question.
Go ahead.
So I'm a master's level Buddhist student and a long time, rather hardcore meditator, and would be interested in the Yogacara analysis and advice for the following experience. Doing old school Buddhist form jhanas, very distinctive synesthetic altered states. Following a retreat for a period of about 5 weeks, I was waking up at night in the middle of the sequence. I was doing the jhanas in my sleep.
Whoa, cool.
Yeah, very cool. Not anticipated and out of dreamless sleep. But I'd wake up in the middle of the sequence with something like, and this is totally metaphor, a body memory of having started the sequence before I woke up. But the insight or perspective that lends is how some part of me knows how to sleep, some part of me knows how to do the jhanas, and my waking cognitive process comes from somewhere. It's a generated event. All those things are being put into motion somehow. So somewhat playful, but also serious. What would be a Yogacara perspective on that phenomenon, and what might the next instruction be?
That's an interesting question, and I don't know if I really have a good answer to it. For one thing, the jhanas are incorporated into the Yogacara literature. You know, they are something that's discussed, but they're not integral to the Yogacara path per se, as I read it. Because Yogacara is a Mahayana path where the jhanas are more sort of generic practices that are done across Buddhist schools. So Yogacara practitioners might well cultivate the jhanas, but they wouldn't be viewed particularly as Mahayana. I mean, they might be done within a Mahayana context, obviously. So I think that for the Yogacara, at least as I understand it, if you want to get a sense of what Yogacara meditation literature is really about, what the Yogacara path is, I think the Vedanta Vibhaga is probably the best place to look. And there, I think I do remember discussions of the Bhashas. I think there are people here who probably know this better than me. But again, it's not really central to Vasubandhu's understanding of the path from a Yogacara perspective. So, but that said, all of these practices, now I mentioned earlier that I'm talking about meditation practice in India and Tibet, where the key factor, or the key element is that it's really all about familiarization of the mind with an object of observation. And so you're trying to change your patterning through this familiarization. So the more you become familiar with that particular object, the more your mind is going to change. So it's kind of a blueprint in a sense. So you're trying to transform your mind, and the more time you spend with this, and the term bhavana is related to the root word bu, to be. So it's something that you live with, but it also has a future sense. There's a sense of becoming. So the more you live with this, the more you become different from what you are. And so that's really what this practice is about. That is, familiarizing yourself with something that transforms you in the direction you're trying to do, whereas the jhanas are, in a sense, I think, more abstract. You're sort of, you're not really cultivating particular qualities that are concordant with Mahayana so much as going into altered states that bring about other seriological effects, but things that are more generic across Buddhism rather than simply specific to Yogacara.
Well, that's partly my understanding, that with the jhanas, you're focusing on an object, but allowing it to transform. In other words, you're effecting a synesthesia to where you can see the breath as a pearl or a light. And then when you've got that biofeedback, you can make it do things. And I don't want to dominate the conversation, but if you have a quick note, jhana, my understanding, is a Pali of the more generic Sanskrit jhana, which then goes to Chana and Zen in East Asia. Was that just sort of a vocabulary term available to apply to meditative states?
Well, it was generally used. That the term dhyana was widely used, and so when the Buddhist literature was translated into China, the Chinese would either come up with neologisms or they would have phonetic renderings. So Chan was the closest they could come to dhyana, so it became Chan. And then the Japanese pronunciation is Zen, and then Son in Korean. So that same character was the one that was used to translate the term dhyana.
Appreciate it.
Okay, thank you. So Karen has a follow-up on this one.
Yeah, it's just a really quick follow-up. John, I thought you had one. Thank you for your presentation. Enjoyed it.
Good to see you, Karen.
Yeah, good to see you. And I saw one slide, I thought, where you had in parentheses, like the qualities of the Brahma Viharas as being aspects of the ultimate. Did I imagine that? Because that would be one way in which, does the purified object, what kinds of qualities does it include? So it's permanent, you said, and purifying, but does it include like compassion, loving kindness, etc., which are, jhana meditations as well?
No, what I was trying to say is that these are the things that you accomplish through focusing on the ultimately real. So by focusing on this, you develop compassion and wisdom and generosity and other good qualities.
Okay, so they're byproducts of it, not part of the ultimate.
Well, byproducts of the practice of focusing on it.
Yeah, but they aren't part of the ultimate itself. Yeah. Okay.
Just a question: Where are you located now? Are you still in Nepal?
No, I'm in Berkeley now.
Okay.
I'm at Mangalam Research Center.
Oh, good.
So thank you. So we have Charles Goodman, Brian Van Norton, Jay Garfield, and Joy Brennan. That's going to be the order. Charles.
Thanks. So like others, I found the talk very, very interesting. And it seems like the understanding of Vishuddha Alambana as purifying objective observation, you seem to have some textual context in which that really fits. I'm a little worried about that translation because I don't think that Sanskrit word looks the way I would expect it to look if it meant purifying objective observation.
You think you purified?
Yeah, should be purified because it's a past passive participle. So how would you help me to overcome that obstacle to adopting your interpretation?
I would completely agree with you. And I think it's unfortunate that it is a past passive participle, because I don't think my sense and I think that may be another one of the reasons why people have adopted that reading. That it's an obvious one. It's an obvious way to translate it, and that's why. And I think that may be why this persists over time. And I think it's unfortunate. I wish they hadn't done that. But again, the more I think about it, the more I read what they say about it, the more I see it as not being a past passive participle. And so I think that it may be an unfortunate aspect of how the terminology coined early on in this literature. But that's a really good question. And I think actually now I should note that, because I should make a point of that in my article.
Thank you. Brian?
Well, great talk. Thank you very much. I don't know much about this topic, but I wonder if part of what might be motivating some of the other interpretations of the ultimately real is a desire to protect Yogacara from the following objection. What if someone, assuming you're right about the ultimately real, what if somebody said, well, how is your position different from that of, say, Advaita Vedanta? We've got this ultimately real object. It sounds like it's not a very Buddhist view as you're describing it. But like I say, this is not a literature that I know well, so feel free to answer that in a very elementary way if I'm making an elementary confusion.
Really interesting question, Brian. And I think that the Yogacara response would be that, first of all, it's not a reality. As you know, in the Advaita literature, Brahman is described as Satchidananda, as pure being, pure consciousness, and pure bliss. And obviously, this isn't what the what parinishvana is. It's something that's an absence. It's what you perceive when you eliminate false conceptuality superimposed onto other dependent phenomena. So the elimination of it is what allows you to see this reality. So it's not something that's conscious. It's not something that you could say interact with as meditators do with Brahman. So the Buddhist response is this is something thoroughly different, although like the Advaita conception of Brahman, it is something that's permanent and changeless.
Thank you. Jay.
Thank you very much, John. It's always great to hear a talk from the Yogācāra guy.
Hey, you're in Sanchi.
Exactly. You actually just gave me the entree to the question that I wanted to ask, which is also partly a follow-up on Charles's question. So as you know better than anybody else, because it's all over the Samdhinirmochana, but it's also in Trisvabhavanirdesha, and as you just mentioned, we almost always hear the parinishvana described as the absence of the imagined in the dependent, the emptiness of the dependent of the imagined, some version of that formula. And I was kind of surprised that it didn't turn up more in your presentation. And in particular, it strikes me that it's one of the ways of making sense of the intuition that Gajin Nagao had, even though I think that he goes, as you pointed out, sometimes in the wrong direction from it. So let me just try this out on you. And it also comes back to the Visuddhya Lambana in a moment. If we really take that formula seriously as our starting point, then the Paratantra, the dependent nature, really is a pivot in a really important way. It can appear to one in either of two ways. You can either parakalpify it, and it appears to you with a superimposition of the parakalpita, or you can stop doing that, and that very Paratantra appears without the parakalpita, and it's that absence of the parakalpita that's the parinishvana. So in a sense, these are achievements. They're not achievements that transform the fundamental nature of things, but they are achievements that transform one's experience of the nature of things. And then if we think of the parinishvana as a Visuddhya Lambana, then it kind of starts making sense. It's a purified object. Namely, what is it purified of? It's purified of the parakalpita. It's the paratantra purified of the parakalpita as opposed to all mushed up with it. So I just want to strike a little bit of a blow for that pivotal model as a model that's not nearly as bankrupt as you suggest, especially if it's paired with the sequential model. Because in the order of realization, as it's again made clear, both in the Samdhi and in the Trisvabhavanirdesha, we start with the parakalpita, then we come to see that the parakalpita is a superimposition on the paratantra. Then we see the paratantra purified of the parakalpita. But in either case, that paratantra, being dependent origination after all, has got a very particular nature. And again, the final piece of this is that allows us to see the close affinity of Yogacara to Madhyamaka, because then we see that the ultimate nature and the conventional nature, or independent origination, emptiness and dependent origination, are the same entity seen in different ways. The paratantra can either be seen as conventional with parakalpita or as ultimate with parinishvana. I don't know, that just seems to me to be a way to tie it all up.
Well, I'm really glad you said that, because you actually kind of clarified where I think the problem comes in Nagao's interpretation, okay? So I think we need to focus on the Lakshana aspect of these three natures or characters. So we're not talking about Paratantra per se, we're talking about Paratantra Lakshana, that is the character in terms of which we perceive it. So Paratantra is no more real than anything else. These are simply dependently arisen objects that are changing. So we can perceive these dependently arisen objects with a conceptual overlay, that is parikalpita, or we can perceive them as dependent risings, which is conventionally accurate. But we're not perceiving Paratantra per se, these are still overlays, these are still perceptions. So it's only when we eliminate this. So we're looking at mental, mental events here, okay? So parinishpana is really what we see when we eliminate this. So we're not really seeing anything. We're not seeing Paratantra. We're seeing the absence of parikalpita.
We're seeing absence of parikalpita in Paratantra, at least if I believe the Samdhinirmochana and if I believe the Trisvabhavanadesha.
Right, but again, we're not seeing Paratantra. We're seeing the absence.
Seeing the absence but the basis of the absence.
But we no longer, the thing that is important here is we're no longer seeing Paratantra as Paratantra.
Well, okay, so this is our
because
fight.
we're not seeing dependent arising. If we saw dependent arising, we would still be seeing Paratantra, not Parinishpana.
All right, I'm not going to take any more time. This is where our fight is. Okay.
Okay, but anyways, it's good to clarify because it's an interesting fight. And again, I think that Nagar was a great scholar. Alan Spanberg was a great scholar. These people had reasons for what they said. I just think that they happen to be wrong, as we all are sometimes.
No, Jay, fight it away. We have time. So I enjoy watching people fight. If you want,
I truly am tempted to, but John and I have so much time to fight, and there's so many people here who have got questions. I don't want to stand in their way.
Okay, all right.
We spend a lot of time fighting too.
Right, that's true. Okay, Joy.
Hi, everybody. Hi, John. Thank you.
Hi, Joy.
So I think I'm in agreement with you on a lot of things, but it's provocative, so it raises some questions. I have one specific textual question about something I've always been puzzled by, and I think I'll start there. So actually I referenced this as like a source of puzzlement in that article that you have on your slide at the end. Mm-hmm. In the Mahayana Sutra Alampura commentary, it says, this is the only place I think it says this, that the absolute nature, the parinishpana, is both naturally pure and to be purified. Do you have an account of that? I find it puzzling for the reasons largely that you've outlined, that I think what you're saying seems persuasive.
It's a really good question. And I've also been puzzled by that. And I think my puzzlement originally came when I saw your article. I thought, oh, damn.
Okay, no, so that's fair to not have. That's fair to not have. I just thought I would throw it out there. So my bigger question.
Just briefly, what I would say is I think that the way I would read it is that what's to be purified here is our perception of it, not necessarily it itself.
So, okay, this gets at my question. The language of talking about the three natures as modes of perception. So it's an epistemological characterization of it. Mm-hmm. I get it because they are natures of dharmas, and we think of dharmas as objects of perception. But it's also true that dharmas it's like it's an analytical category because, of course, they constitute the subject perceiver too, right?
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah.
So then this raises the question of, like, of course, our categories of ontology and epistemology can fail to capture things in Buddhist thought. And for me, it raises the question of, is it the case that whatever is the transformation that is entailed by, like, thoroughly realizing the absolute nature actually is you said a minute ago, you were referencing the word bhavana, that it's a transformation in being of a sort, much like becoming a Buddha. That was my article, was like, it's parallel to realizing nirvana, right?
And it has a future sense. That is a sense of becoming.
Yes, in becoming. Yeah. So, and if that's the case, then it's like the constitution of, I'll just use the category of the person, like you're talking about the meditator. Like in conventional terms, we say a person sits down and meditates, right? So the person then is actually becoming the absolute. And so I don't want to say that the absolute changes. Like, you've persuaded me in some sense, but if one can become that, then maybe there is mutability. So I'm throwing this out there. It's not a firm thesis, but it's something to think about. I wonder what you think about that. It's
really interesting. I would say, my response would be that the person isn't becoming the absolute. That is, the Buddha isn't the absolute. If you were to look at, say, Dharmakaya, that might be equated with the absolute. So in that sense, yes, I guess you could say that. But what you're doing more on a phenomenological level is you are moving from the point of being an ordinary being with false perceptions to achieving bodhicitta and entering the bodhisattva path, then progressing through the bhumis toward Buddhahood, and along the way you're accumulating qualities that you didn't have before. So there's this gradual sense that you're doing this, and the constant, according to the Yogacara literature, is that you have this unchanging object of observation, alambana, that you're using throughout this to purify your perceptions and to eliminate negative qualities, but you're not becoming parinishvana. You're using parinishvana as you're focusing on parinishvana because this is something that never changes, it's permanent, it's all pervasive and always real. And so in a sense, you are, as you said, kind of approximating that in the development of your mind, and you're sort of actualizing the Dharmakaya. But I don't think it's quite accurate to say that you're becoming parinishvana, because you're becoming a Buddha, and in becoming a Buddha, you're able to respond to other beings and to do all sorts of Buddha stuff, which parinishvana can't do. Parinishvana can only facilitate that transformation to the point where you become a Buddha, and then you can do Buddha stuff.
Okay.
But yeah, it's a really interesting question, and I think again, this is the sort of thing that keeps us all in business. That these texts, can be interpreted in many ways, and they have things that make you think, oh, damn, it really does say that, doesn't it?
Yeah. If I could weigh in on your fight with Jay, not to re-provoke it, but I do think we have to account for the abandoning, which you have in your Samdi Nirmochana quote on one of your slides. And the dependent nature is the object of abandonment. So it strikes me that it can't be a pivot in the way Nagao made it. Okay.
Exactly, and that quote by Jangdrup Sudral really sums it up. It says, it is not a Vishuddhanabhata. So he's making that point very explicitly, and I think explicitly refuting any future attempts to take the Paratantra as being primary.
Okay, Paul and Charles.
John, thanks for the talk. It's fantastic.
Hey, Paul.
Always great to hear you. Say that you had a phrase on one of your slides. I think it was the Ashraya Pravartana.
Yeah,
you didn't really talk. I mean, you didn't really talk about that or bring that in relationship to your main thesis. I'm just curious how you interpret that phrase in the context of the three natures, and what Ashraya is actually referring to in that context.
Well, it's a good question. And there are probably other Yogacara wallahs who know that better than me, but this is something that shows up a lot in Yogacara literature. Ron Davidson has written probably the most extensive discussion of this in his PhD thesis, which unfortunately was never published. It's a great thesis. But it's if you want to see what Ashraya Parivarta is, that's the place to look. But anyway, the basis is referring to the person, to the psychophysical continuum of the person, and the transformation is the transformation of the bodhisattva that culminates in Buddhahood.
Okay.
So this is a very high level of realization, and it's seen to be something that happens on the path of seeing, on Darshana Marga. So and this is sort of like in some of the Yogacara texts, it's kind of the key thing that happens on the path of seeing.
Interesting. So it's not really related in any sense to the three natures or anything like that.
Not directly, no. It's just, in a sense, it's kind of the outcome of focusing on parinishvana.
Cool. Thanks.
Charles?
This Charles here?
Yes, you're the.
Yeah, we have a couple of Charleses.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
well, thanks for a great talk, John. I'm going to weigh in, and as a non-specialist in any kind of Yogacara, I'll probably cause many eyes to roll. I want to say first that hearing Mr. Collins talk about his experience of jhanas in his sleep, I thought, well, he's practicing the pajanas then. Sorry. Okay, so
You should be sorry, Chuck.
I should. I'm deeply
Nice to know
ashamed
you
of
haven't
myself.
changed, Chuck.
I am deeply ashamed of myself now. Okay, so when you were talking about how some of the confusion that you are perceiving in the scholarship may be because of conflating two different functions of the three natures, I don't think at that point in the talk you had brought out the sequential model, but I remember that in Sponberg's article, he did say there's a pivotal model where the turning of the base really is the change from a parikalpita view of Paratantra to a parinishpana view of Paratantra, but that in East Asia, that pivot got flattened out and it became a kind of a three-step process. And it sounded to me like those were the two things you were saying people were conflating and causing confusion. Is that getting at it?
That is, and I think that his progressive model is a more accurate representation of what the Yogacara texts say. But he's saying that they all have what he calls the pivotal model, and he cites the Mahayana Sutra Alamkara as the key source for his reading for Indian Yogacara texts.
Yeah, I mean, what he says is it's in East Asia that the pivot got flattened.
Yeah.
Now this is interesting because it goes to, I teach this to undergraduates from time to time. And again, as a non-specialist, I may customized role, but part of what I'd always seen in this is that in a rough way, parikalpita is sort of conventional truth and parinishpana is kind of ultimate truth. And the problem with Madhyamaka was they never could say ultimate truth about what, imputational truth about what, and Paratantra was kind of the way of filling in what these are truths or mistakes about. And that's why the pivot model always kind of made sense to me.
Yeah, well,
it's the object.
I think it made sense to a lot of other people too. Yeah, no, I agree. I think that there is a conceptual clarity to the pivotal model. I just think that it's wrong.
Okay, that's conclusive enough. Douglas Duckworth.
Hey, John. Yeah, thanks for your talk. And yeah, I think we've spoken about this before, but just because you're publishing something, I think it's worth mentioning again. I put something in the chat from Ratnakara Shanti's Madhyamaka Alamkara Upadesha, where he talks about two types of parinishpana. One is the undistorted wisdom, and then one is the unchanging parinishpana. So one is the undistorted parinishpana, and one is the unchanging parinishpana. So it does seem like it captures like what Joy was bringing out. Not just the ontological dimension where it's an object that that seems very.
And that also would seem to tie in with the two functions that I mentioned earlier.
Right. But it seems like the idea of like something that is unchanging, regardless of whether there's a subject, is this, unchanging parinishpana. But then the subject, for knowing that and there being no real intrinsic distinction in a Yogacara world between a subject and object. So then the subject must have some, transformation, like what Jay was bringing up too. So I think this way of presenting them as, the subjective dimension, or at least the participatory dimension that's undistorted, to flag that as this type of parinishpana, and then the other one that is the Vishuddha Alambana that is never changing, and it's not. But I think that might be something you could note, because I think it does clarify this tension, these two poles between the epistemological and ontological nature.
Yeah, thank you for that, because I haven't seen that source, and that's something that I can definitely use in my article. I can see exactly the point where I can insert that.
Yeah, I just searched in Paul Hackett's, I see Paul here too, his database. I just looked up the Chinjimalope Yondru, and a few hits came. They were all late Indians, but Ratnakara Shanti, I just chose that one.
Okay, yeah, that's a really good source, and as you said, it does. I think for me, it helps to make my point that there are two functions for parinishpana in the literature, and the conflation of them is where I think the problems begin.
Thanks
for that.
Eyal.
So thank you, John, again for this. I mean, like everybody else, I really enjoyed it, and now I'm looking forward to read the article. I'm going to just go and piggyback on two things that Joy said, and maybe that sort of like open up the question that may be helpful for me. I mean, first of all, in none of the East Asian material that I'm working with, I ever encounter anything remotely like the pivotal model. Now, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, but I always blame the Tibetan for that. Now I understand it's actually Nagao. I'm sort of like going, and when it hit me was when I read precisely what what Joy was referring to from the Sandhi-Nirmochana Sutra, where the text said that the dependent nature is the object of elimination. It's like, oh, wow. If it's a pivotal, if it's there to remain, the text should not say that we need to get rid of it. And it sort of reiterated in different ways. Now, another thing that Joy said was these are three, I mean, that's the way that Joy put it. I mean, we, Sonam Kachuru and Bryce Eubner and myself working on an article on the three nature that we're trying to, for a reason that I can talk to Joy later, refrain from using it as three modes of perception. But I take it very seriously that if it's a yogic text, right? If it's a yogic framework, this is about a transformation of the yogi, right? And therefore, I wonder if the Parinishpana then, you know, and this is something that Doug also alluded to. One of the problems is that we get hung up on trying to portray the Parinishpana as an ontological. The ontological things as they are out there, sort of like a la Kant, and maybe the way that we need to think about it is you know, and then here's the way that the Mahayana Sangha refer to it, right? When it's a state with the way that the Buddha perceived the world, right? That's the mode of perception where the Buddha see the world as a, and this is the quote from the Mahayana Sangha, as a flow of non-conceptual wisdom. Right, and even when you want to take the Vishuddhi Alambana, right, the Alambana is still a mode of perception, right? It's a perceptual object, right? So it's still maybe not an ontological thing out there that never changes and will, you know, the yogi sees. And if I wonder if you think that seeing it this way, first of all, if I'm completely misrepresent the tradition, and if we see it this way, can it help us then maybe solve the conundrum of how we have both the ontological and the soteriological mixed up?
Good questions. I'll start first with Nagao. The only source that he cites that I think accords with, you know, that accords with his reading is the Zen statement about mountains and rivers. But of course, that's not Yogacara. And I think that it indicates that his reading was derived from, or at least strongly influenced by, Zen, rather than by following the texts themselves. So I mean, you know, again, Nagao was one of the best scholars ever in our field. So it's hard to say what he was thinking, what he was doing, and he obviously knew the Yogacara literature probably better than any of us. But still, you know, it's still possible to get wrong in those cases. But that to me indicates what his source most likely was. You know, how he was reading this. Now, the next part of your question is interesting. What were you asking in particular? I got lost with the Nagao.
Yeah, I was asking if seeing and this Jay is continuing the conversation, but I was asking if we just seeing as a soteriological model and
okay, I remember
those
now,
three,
yeah.
right, those three nature as just ways of perceiving.
Well, one thing that occurred to me when you're talking about Parinishpana as an alambana is you could compare this to, for instance, the way meditators will say begin their practice with the creation of sand mandala, and then during that initiation they'll memorize the sand mandala, and then in their daily practice they'll recreate it mentally, and they'll focus on this, and the mandala becomes a sort of blueprint for cognitive restructuring. Because the mandala encodes all sorts of things, like, you know, that represent the mind of a Buddha and its various good qualities. So the more your mind becomes familiar with this, the more your mind comes to be changed in accordance with that. So the mandala is a visualization. It's something, you know, the sort of an abstract object that you use to bring about this process. So focusing on this brings about cognitive change. And I think that this is exactly what the Yogacara text is saying about Parinishpana. That is, you're focusing on this object, and this is and that object does particular things to you. That is that, you know, the more you focus on it, the more you develop these good qualities that are concordant with Buddhahood, and that will eventually constitute the matrix of supreme qualities of a Buddha.
Thank you.
Just as, you know, focusing on a mandala would do.
Thank you. Grand Priest.
Yeah, I have a question that's, I think, tangential to your talk, but it's always puzzled me about Yogācāra. And since I'm a Yogācāra specialist online, I thought I'd take advantage of asking it.
You have a lot of them online, actually.
Excellent, excellent. What do you understand to be the relationship between the alaya and the consummate nature?
I don't think I've ever heard that before. I don't think there is one, really. I mean, the alaya, as conceived in the Yogācāra literature, is said to be a collection of seeds of past cognitive events. And it's said to be, it says, this is another thing that begins with Sandhi and Mochana, probably. It's said to be, it's compared to a river. So you have these seeds that are deposited by your volitional actions, and they flow along, and the trajectory of the river is moved along by the energy of these events. And then when the conditions are ripe, the seeds will sprout, and they will form cognitive, they will form concordant outcomes. And the elimination of the alaya is equated with ashraya paravrti, the transformation of the basis. So you eventually eliminate alaya entirely, and you end up with a purified alaya. So in that sense, I guess you could say that the purified alaya would be the result, would be the outcome of focusing on parinishvana. But I don't think that there's really any sort of correlation between the two, except in the sense that, by focusing on parinishvana, you bring about the elimination of the alaya as alaya, and then you end up with amala vijnana, the pure consciousness, pure alaya.
Okay, so in the enlightenment state, which is the aim of it all, is it the alaya that perceives the consummate nature?
Well, yes and no, because once you've eliminated all of the mental afflictions, there's no longer alaya. It's amala vijnana, stainless vijnana. So it's now pure consciousness, freed from any sort of mental afflictions. And so that would be perceiving parinishvana, because in a sense that's all a purified consciousness would be able to perceive, is ultimate reality.
Okay, so this is kind of coming from an East Asian perspective. I mean, pure consciousness often gets taken to be the consummate nature in the East Asian tradition. Is this?
That I don't know. I know very little about the East Asian interpretation of Yogācāra. The only East Asian interpreter that I've read is Wanchuk. And I've read Wanchuk thoroughly, but Wanchuk really comes at it very much from an Indian perspective. So he's really following the Indian materials, and all of his sources are really Indian materials. So he's not bringing in East Asian interpretations to any significant degree.
Okay, thank you.
So, but yeah, basically, I don't know. There are probably people here who would know this, but I'm not one of them.
Anyone wants to chime in, or what about the conversation in the chat room? Anybody wants to sort of bring it out into the open?
Can I just say something about what Grand Priest said? Just to respond. Tao, is that okay?
Oh yeah. No, I think go ahead. Yeah, so sorry.
So from East Asian perspective, the East Asian tradition evolves in a way that sort of depart from the Indian model, and then we get different interpretation of Tathagata Garbha and Buddha nature, and so it just becomes really complicated, and it depends what kind of tradition we're talking about, and how they relate to Yogācāra. So Huayan, for example, as you probably know, build on quite a bit on the critique of the Xuanzang forms of Yogācāra, and a departure from. So it's complicated.
But also, like I say, if you were to look at the Chishinlin, or the Awakening of Faith, the three natures doesn't really factor into that at all. And that's arguably one of the most influential streams of thought in East Asian Buddhism, and it's often seen as Yogacara, but it doesn't really rely on that schema for its understanding, and it's much more focused on Buddha nature theory.
Okay, so anybody else? Jay.
Yeah, this is Joy and I have been batting some ideas around in chat, and so I'll just bring it out into a public discourse, which really is relitigating some of my discussion with John earlier, but in a slightly different register. I just wanted to respond to the idea that seeing the Paratantra as an object of relinquishment somehow undermines the pivotal interpretation. I just don't think that it does at all. Because again, you need to put that together with, and I just keep coming back to this, the definition of paranishpana as the absence of the parakalpita in the Paratantra. And so what that means is that if what you're looking for is the object that's going to take you to awakening, you don't focus on the Paratantra, you focus on the absence of the parakalpita in the Paratantra. That's what the relinquishment amounts to. That still leaves the Paratantra as the locus of parakalpita and the locus of the absence. And that was the idea that Nagao was really riffing on, whatever other mistakes he made. And I think that part is gotta be dead right. And there again, you see this parallel between Yogacara and Madhyamaka that I think is really important to bring out. If I'm thinking about emptiness in the Madhyamaka tradition, and I'm looking at an object, like say a table, what I want to do is come to focus on the absence of intrinsic nature in the table, not the table, right? So I might be relinquishing the table as an object of contemplation in favor of the emptiness of the table, but the basis of the emptiness is still the table. And I can't make sense of the emptiness without the table. I think that whole set of insights about the relationship between conventional and ultimate, the Nobo Chikla Dokpa Tada idea, is just not lost in Yogacara at all. And that you have to kind of see Yogacara as a subjective version of Madhyamaka at some point, if you're going to make sense of how these things hang together. So again, there might be a whole lot wrong with what I'm saying, but I do not think that you've got an entailment from the idea that the Paratantra is an object of relinquishment to the idea that the pivot model that sees the Paratantra both as the basis of parakalpita and as the basis of paranishpana is wrong.
I'm really glad you brought that up, because that actually helps to clarify, I think, what our disagreement is. It also brings me back to the Sandhya Sutra, where it starts discussing analogies. And so there's one point where it talks about exactly that idea of no chikdokatade, of something that is a mere elimination of something, or something that's a conceptual quality of something. And there are a number of analogies that it brings up. Like, for instance, a lute, a vina in Sanskrit, and its melodious qualities, the melodious structure of the lute. So in other words, these are things that you can discern mentally, but the melodious quality is not the lute.
No, but its basis is the lute. They're not substantially different. They are intentionally distinct. They're not extensionally distinct, and that's
right. And I think that's why the
and that's carried over. That's the same idea in Yogacara and Madhyamaka.
But I think that's why the Gelugpas came up with this idea of it being O Chiktopatade, which is something that a lot of other Tibetan exegesis, reject. Yeah. They say that's conceptually ridiculous. But I still would go back to the idea that you're not, when you're perceiving paranishpana, you're not perceiving paratantra. You're perceiving an absence.
That's right.
And an absence is not a thing.
That's right, John, but you're perceiving an absence in the Paratantra. And that's
not necessarily. It doesn't, the
only,
text does not say.
Yes, it does. Seventh chapter, And
it doesn't say you're perceiving an absence in parinishpana. You're seeing, what it says is, when you no longer perceive parikalpita, then you perceive parinishpana.
No, it also defines, in the questions of Paramartha Samudgata, the 7th chapter, it defines parinishpana as the emptiness of the paratantra of the parakalpita, to quote Power's translation.
Right, but again, it's emptiness. It's not paratantra.
That's right. I've agreed with that, John. There's no question. It's just that what that doesn't do is eliminate the pivot model, because the paratantra remains the basis both of the superimposition of parakalpita and of the absence of parakalpita. And that's the crucial role of paratantra.
Not really, because paratantra is one of 3 modes. So it's not that you get to
natures. It's one of 3 gobos.
Yeah. So, but it's not that you get to a true paratantra, because paratantra is one of 3 epistemic modes.
No, well, not epistemic modes. I mean, the claim is that, at least if you believe Trisvabhavanirdeśa, these are 3 noble, 3 and 3.
Okay, well, 3. Okay, three natures. Yeah.
Yeah. So exactly. Be careful. And you translated it that way as well. So,
what kind of an idiot would translate that?
I know. So I just think that you're underestimating the analytical power of that pivot model, both as a way of understanding the sequential model and as a way of understanding the kind of the ontological relation between these from the standpoint of a Yogacara phenomenology that I think links quite happily to a Madhyamaka metaphysics. Anyway, now I'm going to stop. I won't keep litigating this.
Okay. Anyway, I still disagree with this, but we're probably getting into really obscure aspects and getting a bit repetitive here.
Okay, Joy.
Well, I don't know. Should I ask a question and sort of continue or not? I don't have to.
No, go ahead. We have 5 minutes.
Okay, I go back and forth. Actually, my dissertation, I called it the paradox of purity, because how can these 2 things go together? So Jay, like, it's partially persuasive to me what you're saying, but then I would ask, what is relinquished? Like, in the kind of language you were just using, what is relinquished? And it can't be the parikalpita, because, and actually Stirumati says this, because it never existed in the first place, right?
Right.
So what is it? You tell me.
On my reading, what is relinquished is the paratantra as the object, as the alambana. So again, just think about this. Let's move from a Madhyamaka context to a Yogacara context. If I'm meditating on emptiness, I might begin by looking at my table, but I've got to stop doing that. What I've got to start doing is looking at the absence of intrinsic nature in the table. The absence has to replace the basis as the object. I've got to relinquish the table as the alambana of my state in favor of the absence that's there. Similarly, I have to, with the paratantra, relinquish the paratantra as the alambana of my cognitive state in favor of the absence. What absence? The absence of the parakalpita there, just like it's the absence of intrinsic existence in a table.
Okay, I think I agree with you. Can I put it a certain way using slightly different language and just say, would you agree with this? You used the word locus previously a couple minutes ago.
Yeah.
So the dependent nature is the locus of an absence. Wrongly understood, it takes on a causal function of an object.
Yeah.
And so that is what is relinquished, is the causal function, even though the locus of the absence remains. Is that your understanding?
I'm very happy with that.
Okay.
But I would like to come in here because I think that you're making a mistake that Jeffrey Hopkins reported to me one time. Actually, in a class that we had on Yogacara when I was a graduate student. He said he was talking about what it means to say that something is a mere absence of something. That is, when you no longer perceive something that you had previously seen, what does it mean to say that it's a mere absence of I can't remember. Anyway, projection, something like that. Anyway, I can't remember the term. Anyway, so he said when he was a graduate student, he was at University of Wisconsin, And one of the things that everybody wanted was to get a parking place in the underground parking garage because it snowed a lot and it was really cold. So if you parked in the underground parking garage, there were tunnels that went to all the buildings of campus. So you could drive in your warm car, you could park in the middle of winter, you could walk underground to your office and everything, and you didn't have to go up and get cold. So that was really good. So then when he moved to University of Virginia, he had that same paradigm in mind. So the first thing he did when he moved in was he asked some of his colleagues, how do I get a parking spot in the underground parking garage? And they told him, there is no underground parking garage at University of Virginia. And his response was, those bastards, they're trying to keep me from getting a spot. Maybe there's a waiting line or something. So then he went to the parking people and they said, there's no underground parking garage. And he thought, those bastards, they must be keeping the places for their friends, or maybe you have to pay them a bribe in order to get a space. So I don't know whether this is true or not, but he said that he then started mapping out the campus into grids. And during his lunch breaks, he would go out and he would explore the campus starting from the center. And he would, every day, he would explore another bit of it until he got to the outskirts of the campus. And during that process, he failed to find any underground parking garage. And then it occurred to him, aha, there is no underground parking garage here. But there was nothing, he didn't see something in his place like an above ground parking garage or something like that. He saw an absence of what he had expected to see. And that's what this literature is describing. That is, you look at Parikalpita and it seems to be correct, and you relate to objects in that way. Then when you meditate on Parinishpana, you eliminate that false conceptuality. So there's nothing that shows up there as like the true Paratantra. There's just the absence.
No.
Go ahead.
I like that story, by the way. I don't know whether it's really true, whether he's just making this up as an analogy, but I like that idea of the search for something that appears to be real. And then that realization that all of your searching in every possible way has brought to you the irrefutable reality that what you had thought was true isn't. That there's nothing there that appears in its place.
Yeah, that's a fabulous story. So Brian, you'll get the last question.
I don't deserve to have the last question, but I'll ask it anyway. Again, this is not a literature I know well, but I'll just say when Jay describes to me what's going on, I have some sense of what the Parinishpana is supposed to be. I don't perceive it because I'm not enlightened, but I have a sense of what I'm looking for. Can you help me as a beginner to understand if the Parinishpana is not what Jay is saying it is, how should I be thinking of it and how is it related to everything else in the universe? It's not Brahman, okay, got that. But what kind of thing is it? Help me as a beginner to understand what I'm looking for if it's not what Jay is describing to me.
That's a really good last question, Brian, because the texts actually deal with this. That is, and I think it's really clear that the writers were aware of that exact problem. And so they provide a whole set of similes to give you a sense of what it means to say that something is Parinishpana. So it's shunyata, it's emptiness. It's Buddha Koti, it's reality limit. It's tattata, it's suchness. These are things that are ultimate things. They're permanent, they're changeless, they're all pervasive. And it also uses terminology like that. It's permanent, it doesn't change, it never becomes something else. So this is exactly what they're trying to say it is. It's a permanent reality. It's something that's there independently of human activity. It's not, as Nagao says, something brought about by human activity. It's what enables this human activity of the meditation process that brings about the cognitive changes that result in Buddhahood. And that permanence, that stability, that constancy is what makes it what it is and what enables it to function as that sort of meditative object.
Okay, I'm sure that has clarified all the questions. So then let's thank John for this wonderful presentation and thank everybody for your participation. And
I'd like to thank everybody for, these are really interesting questions, and I'm going to, I'm right at the revision point, the final revision for the article, and there are several things that have come up that will help me in that final revision. So thank you all. This has been a very timely presentation and feedback.